Good evening, everybody. My name is Rajkumar, and I'm the Advocacy Director at People for Equality and Relief in Lanka, also known as PEARL. PEARL is a DC-based Tamil advocacy organisation with ECOSOC status, advocating for human rights, justice, and a political solution for Tamils. I would like to welcome you all to this side event on human rights in Sri Lanka. As expressed in the OHCHR's most recent report on Sri Lanka, there is a need for states, multilateral and international institutions and organisations to use their influence to bridge accountability gaps while pressing for tangible results. From PAR's perspective, one way to do this is through genocide recognition. We will now play a short video to kick off the event.
Under international law, genocide is defined by two key elements: genocidal acts and genocidal intent. Genocide means any of the following 5 acts. 1. Killing. 2. Causing serious bodily or mental harm. 3. Deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to physically destroy the group. 4. Preventing births. Or 5. Forcibly transferring the group's children to another group. Committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Sri Lanka committed 3 genocidal acts with genocidal intent against the Tamil people. During the final phase of the war, from January through May 18, 2009, in government-designated no-fire zones. Between 40,000 and nearly 170,000 Tamils were presumed dead, largely due to the Sri Lankan military's intentional shelling of those safe zones. Hospitals, food distribution lines, and areas near humanitarian organization ships were intentionally shelled. This shelling severely injured another 25,000 to 30,000 Tamils who lost limbs or acquired other physical disabilities. Sri Lankan security forces raped and sexually mutilated hundreds of Tamil women and girls who were shot dead. Security forces also sexually tortured countless Tamil detainees. And the Sri Lankan government intentionally limited necessary food, surgical, and other medical supplies for Tamils in the safe zones, causing many survivors to die. Survivors still suffer serious physical and mental trauma. Tamils who survived Sri Lanka's genocide, as well as those who did not, deserve recognition that the crimes committed against them amounted to genocide. Genocide recognition is an important form of accountability, especially in the absence of prosecutions. Please show solidarity with the Tamil people and join the growing international movement to acknowledge Sri Lanka's atrocities as genocide. To learn more, please visit our website.
Thank you. In commemoration of the 15th anniversary of the Mullawaivil genocide, with this event, we mark the launch of PAR's latest briefing paper titled Justice for Genocide, Sri Lanka's Responsibility for Genocide Against the Tamil People in 2009. The paper analyses the legal and factual framework around Sri Lanka's 2009 atrocities and calls on policymakers to formally recognise that Sri Lanka is responsible for genocide against the Tamils. We will hear more on this from my colleague Thilipkumar shortly. We also have the honour of being joined by some incredible Tamil activists, Anushani Alagarajah, the Executive Director at Adayaalam Centre for Policy Research, and Mrs. Leeladevi Anandanadarajah, the General Secretary at the Association for Relatives of Enforced Disappearances. The panel will discuss the importance of justice and accountability, including genocide recognition in Sri Lanka and for the broader Tamil victim survivor community. Following the panel session, there will be a brief Q&A before we close. So our first speaker is Thilipkumar, Pearl's UN Advocacy Officer. Sahi has been with Pearl since 2019 and is an asylum lawyer by profession. Sahi will be delving into Pearl's legal briefing paper on genocide.
Thank you, Ahrabi. Good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to present Pearl's recent legal briefing paper to you today. When Tamil victim survivors speak about the horrific crimes they suffered in 2009, they use the Tamil word Inapadugole, loosely translated as ethnic massacre or genocide, and also a more general Tamil term is Inalipu. This is why Pearl undertook the most comprehensive evidentiary and legal analysis to date of the Sri Lankan government and military's conduct as genocidal acts that were committed with genocidal intent. Pearl's report concludes Sri Lanka is responsible for genocide against the Tamil people from January through May 18, 2009, a period known as the Mullawaikal genocide. During the war's final phase, the Sri Lankan military deliberately shelled government-designated no-fire zones, killing at least 40,000 Tamil civilians, severely injuring another 25,000 to 30,000 Tamils, and attacking hospitals, food distribution lines, and other humanitarian objects. Soldiers raped and sexually mutilated many Tamil women and girls, and security forces physically and sexually tortured countless Tamil men and women detainees. The government deliberately restricted access to necessary food and medical supplies in the war zone and created inhumane conditions for internally displaced Tamils in the de facto internment camps. UN investigations found such conduct may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. However, they were silent on genocide allegations and investigations, prosecutions, and recognition thereof. This report closes that gap. Using evidence from UN investigations, international NGOs, and the media, Pearl applied the legal framework of genocide and found the Sri Lankan government and its forces constituted at least one of the three genocidal acts: killing, causing serious bodily or mental harm, and or deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about their partial physical destruction. These genocidal acts were committed with the intent to destroy the Tamils in the Vanni region, the last area under the control of the LTTE. Pearl determined Sri Lanka's intent to destroy based on the deployment of at least 14 times as many soldiers and special forces as LTTE core fighters in the Vanni and against the Tamils in the Vanni, and deliberately disproportionate attacks in the region, knowing the vast majority of Tamils were civilians who did not pose a serious military threat. Sri Lankan officials made statements conflating and explicitly reframing the civilian population as LTTE combatants, also trying to concealing the genocide under the guise of escalating armed conflict, counterinsurgency, and the global war on terror. One of the most responsible, then Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa, made statements that only LTTE sympathizers were present in the no-fire zones. And to crush the terrorists, there is nothing called unproportionate, quote. And the UN should refer to the dead as people, not civilians, all of which indicate an intent to destroy Tamils in the Vanni. Sri Lanka's 2009 military onslaught did not occur in a vacuum. It was nurtured by Sri Lanka's virulent Sinhala Buddhist majoritarianism, which claimed the island a sacred haven for Buddhists, such as the Sinhala Buddhist identity must reign supreme. Following the island's independence in 1948, Sinhalese governments conducted a series of discriminatory laws and policies under the ideology of Sinhala Buddhist majoritarianism. This Sinhala Buddhist majoritarianism incited structural and physical violence, including 5 pre-war anti-Tamil pogroms in 1956, 58, 77, 81, and 83, which is also called Black July. The Black July pogroms is often considered the spark of the escalation of the armed struggle of the LTT into an internal armed conflict with the Sri Lankan government. The war was marked by violence, killing, injuring, and displacing hundreds of thousands of Tamils. Since the beginning of the war until the ceasefire in 2008, more than 70,000 people were killed, predominantly Tamils in the North-East. In addition, since the 1980s, Sri Lanka has had a backlog of 60,000 to 100,000 unresolved and forced disappearances, of whom tens of thousands were Tamils disappeared in the context of the armed conflict. The number of Tamil people unaccounted for and presumed dead during the final 5 months of the war ranged from 40,000 to 169,796, and most civilian casualties were caused by government shelling. These final months are known as the Mullawaikal genocide. At the LTT's peak in the early 2000s, it controlled 76% of Sri Lanka's northeast, creating the de facto state of Tamalulam, whose de facto capital was in Kilinochchi in the Vanni. Meanwhile, the Sri Lankan government's stated goals were to defeat the LTT, dismantle its de facto state, and recreate a unitary state on the island. The LTT's territory shrank as Sri Lanka took control until only a contiguous area in the Vani remained under LTT control. In September 2008, Sri Lanka launched its final military offensive to capture the Vani region. According to the UN, about 300,000 Tamil civilians were trapped in this war zone as of early 2009. During the final months of the war, the Sri Lankan government and its forces engaged in the following conduct constituting one or more genocidal acts. Deliberate shelling, government designated no-fire zone, killing at least 40,000 Tamil civilians. On average, that was 1,000 Tamils killed each day in the final 2 weeks, and severely injuring another 25 to 30,000 Tamils. Deliberately shelling hospitals, food distribution lines, and other humanitarian objects, raped and sexually mutilated at least hundreds of Tamil women and girls, and this is an underestimate because survivors greatly underreported experiencing sexual violence. Physically and sexually tortured countless Tamil men and women detainees, deliberately restricted access to necessary food and medical supplies, and created inhumane conditions for internally displaced Tamils. There is extensive evidence that Sri Lanka's military offensive was undertaken with genocidal intent, that is, the intent to destroy in part an ethnic group. Deployment of a disproportionate number of soldiers and special forces, Sri Lankan government and its forces' consistent methodical conduct against Tamils in the Vani, Sri Lankan government's and its forces' deliberate disproportionate attacks against Tamil civilians, the government's conflation and reframing of Tamil civilians with LTT combatants, despite knowing the vast majority were civilians fleeing violence, Sri Lankan government's deliberate underestimates of number of civilians in the war zone, high number of civilian deaths, humanitarian crisis for the internally displaced Tamils, and in sum, Sri Lanka executed genocidal acts against Tamils in the Vani with the intent to destroy them, that is, at the end, genocidal intent. On behalf of the hundreds of thousands of Tamil victims and survivors of 2009, Pearl urges you to support the growing international movement to recognize that Sri Lanka is responsible for genocide against the Tamil people in 2009. Policymakers in Canada, France, Italy, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom and the United States have already recognized the genocide against the Tamil people. Formal recognition of a state's responsibility for genocide by policymakers does not attach legal consequences. However, it is an important measure of accountability in its own right, especially in the absence of international criminal investigations. Genocide recognition is also critical given the ongoing human rights violations and the persecution of Tamils in the Vani today, who continue to live under military occupation. Governments should carry out the genocide determination and apply national and universal jurisdiction as relevant to investigate allegations of all international crimes. Policymakers should formally recognize that Sri Lanka is responsible for genocide against the Tamil people in 2009 and call for the establishment of an international criminal justice mechanism to investigate alleged Sri Lankan perpetrators of all international crimes and prosecute those most responsible. UN entities, including the OHHR Sri Lanka Accountability Project, should expressly consider genocide allegation in its analysis of evidence, even without determining individual responsibility for genocide. The international community must bring Sri Lankan perpetrators, including one of the world's worst crimes, to justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sahi. I'd just like to say that the briefing paper is available in whole on PAL's website, and it is also available to read by scanning the QR code that's at the back of the table there, and the executive summary is also available there if you'd like to read it as well. Our next speaker is Mrs. Leeladevi Anandanadarajah, who's the General Secretary at the Association for Relatives of Enforced Disappearances. As a victim herself, Mrs. Anandanadarajah and her organisation have worked tirelessly to raise awareness of the plight of the Tamil families who have disappeared and the absence of justice and accountability for the Tamil people who've been forcibly disappeared by the Sri Lankan state. So over to you.
Good afternoon, all of you. I am Mrs. Leeladevi Anandanadarajah, victimized mother, General Secretary for the Association for the Relatives of the Enforced Disappearances in the North and East of Sri Lanka. My eldest son was made to disappear by the Sri Lankan army, who surrendered at Omanda checkpost after the end of the final war in 2000 May. the enforced disappearances, one of the worst human rights violations, have been occurring in Sri Lanka since 1958. The lack of accountability for these violations and the silence maintained by the international community and their collective organizations emboldened Sri Lanka. This led to an escalation of violence against the Tamil people, which resulted in the pogroms of 1977 and 1983. The Sri Lanka government had named this cruelty as communal riots. Is it communal riots? No, it is genocide. It is a well-planned sabotage to evacuate Tamils from the country. Invaluable belongings and properties of Tamils were destroyed and committed arson. What is communal riot? Two communities with the same strength and same ratio in population attacking each other is communal riot. What happened in Sri Lanka? The weak-kneed Tamil ran for shelter and existence. The barbaric Sinhalese chased them and hacked and chopped them with knives and hammered with batons and killed them and looted worthy jewelry from the amputees. Is it not a genocide? If the humanitarian international community or the United Nations had questioned Sri Lanka government at the first instant, the subsequent attempt by the Sinhalese people would have been prevented in the subsequent years 1971, 1977, 1983 and sporadic violence against Tamils in the between years. But all the countries were with the frolic attitude towards the atrocity which had been inflicted by the Sinhalese against the innocent Tamil civilians. Negligence of the international community had induced Sinhalese for the continuous repression on Tamils and for communal partiality and well-planned Sinhala colonization in the Tamil soil and land aggregation by the Sinhala government. Aggregation of such evil doing had instigated the innocent Tamil youth to fight against the wrongdoers. The Sri Lanka government had promulgated these fair and reasonable activities as terrorism. Finally, in May 2009, many more Tamil civilians, including small children and women, were massacred under the disguised eradication of terrorism with the blessing of the international community. Following this, the humanitarian catastrophe was carried out in Mullawaikal once again in the year 2009. The Sri Lankan government misled the international community with fabricated stories claiming they were eradicating terrorism, making the world an accomplice. The Sinhalese government, responsible for the disappearance of 150,000 people and the forced disappearances of 20,000 including infants in 2009, has yet to be held accountable. We who are tirelessly fighting to learn the fate of our disappeared loved ones and seeking justice continue to face repression from intelligence agencies and the police. Numerous commissions have been set up to deceive the international community, buying time so that those in power can retain their positions and later shift responsibility to their successors. How can we expect justice from the Sri Lankan government when its presidents have promised the Sinhalese people that no military personnel will be punished? This is why we are seeking international inquiries and justice, and we continue our struggle in that direction. For those urging us to accept domestic mechanisms, we would like to remind them of this reality. In 2000, Sunil Ratnayaka was sentenced to death for the brutal murder of 8 people, including children in Mirsuri. His conviction was based on the testimony of a survivor who managed to escape and accurately identified the suspect in a lineup. However, when Gotabaya Rajapaksa assumed office as president, his first act was to grant Sunil Ratnayaka a presidential pardon, releasing him from prison. What does this indicate? Successive presidents are willing to do anything to protect military personnel from punishment. A similar situation occurred in the case of 11 students murdered at the Trincomalee naval base. In order to prevent the arrest of naval officer, a resolution was passed and implemented in the cabinet. Given such circumstances, how can we expect justice from domestic mechanisms? The Sri Lankan government's claim of resolving the issues through domestic mechanisms is akin to entrusting a murderer to deliver justice for the crime he committed. The perpetrator has no right to deliver justice. Many of those who were forcibly disappeared after the final war were individuals who had either surrendered, been handed over, or were taken away for investigation, as well as those arrested while receiving medical treatment. The enforced disappearances of these individuals were carried out by military officers responsible for the final phase of the war in places like Mullivaikal, Selvapuram, Vattuvagal and Omandai. All those officers are still alive today, many of them holding high ranks and diplomatic positions. If they are investigated, they will reveal what happened to our relatives. Instead, repeatedly questioning us, the affected is merely a tactic to divert attention, not a genuine effort to find our missing loved ones. This is a reality the international community must understand. The Office of Missing Persons, that OMP, which has been proven ineffective and rejected by us, is more concerned with interrogating the families of the disappeared rather than investigating those responsible for the disappearances. They are trying in various ways to close the case of enforced disappearances by exploiting the economic hardships of the families, offering compensation of 2 lakhs rupees and issuing death certificates. And OMB is pressuring families to obtain death certificates. They are even blackmailing families by threatening to stop welfare programs if they don't comply with the death certificate progress by the Gramanladari's officers and also Samthi officers. Over 250 of us who have been fighting for international justice for 2,759 days since February 20th, 2017 have died without receiving justice for their children. We too are counting our final days. The international community must step forward to ensure that a resolution is reached while we are still alive. Alongside extending the UN mechanism for gathering documentation, there must be swift, parallel progress to bring the Sri Lankan government before the International Criminal Court based on the evidences already collected by the UN organization OSLAM. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Mrs. Leeladevi Anandanadarajah, who is the General Secretary at the Association for Relatives of Enforced Disappearances. Our final speaker is Anushani Alagarajah, the Executive Director at Adayaalam Centre for Policy Research. Over the past 9 years, Anushani has worked very closely with war-affected Tamil-speaking communities in the North and East of Sri Lanka, researching and authoring many research reports on several conflict-affected communities across Sri Lanka, including the families of the disappeared and ex-combatants. Since 2017, Anushani has been engaging in advocacy efforts on human rights violations against the Tamil community, both nationally and internationally. Recently, she was a Senior Minority Fellow in 2023 at the OHCHR. Over to you, Anushani.
Thank you, Ahrabi. I don't have a speech prepared, but I thought I would address some of the issues that were discussed today at the Council. We heard a lot about economic stability today, and a lot of countries mentioning the economic crisis and the recovery of it, almost as a justification for the human rights violations that were committed in the past. In the last 2 years, ever since the economic crisis would have started, we saw this trend of shifting the weight from the human rights violations, the human rights accountability, to the economic accountability. There is very little acknowledgement about why there was an economic crisis in the first place. But again, for those of us who live there, there were signs. There were always signs for everything. To quote the High Commissioner in his address today, the entrenched impunity has manifested itself in the corruption, abuse of power, and governance failures that were among the root causes of the country's recent economic crisis. Depending on who you speak to and their location within the country, they will tell you different versions of the economic crisis. For people who live in the North and East, the economic crisis was not something so huge. We have lived through it several times. We have lived under economic embargoes. When the crisis happened, people pretended, Tamil people in the North and East pretended like it wasn't a crisis that is affecting them because they were so used to it. But interestingly, even during the economic crisis, you would think a state would prioritize its citizen and the needs of them, while people were waiting in lines for gas and oil and food, while Colombo was erupting in different protests. The government was building Buddhist temples in Tamil lands, taking the traditional lands of Tamil people. The temples were so huge, you were able to see from the map with the GPS. The lands were being actively taken by different support with different institutions supported by the state and the military. There were many human rights violations that were happening in the period of economic crisis where you would think the government would be focusing on fixing the economic crisis. It is a classic case of Sri Lanka. The priorities are always misplaced in Sri Lanka. But moving to human rights accountability, the reason why we had to come to UN in the first place is because of the human rights violations that were committed. So again, for the victim communities, it makes very little sense to completely ignore the dialogue on human rights accountability and focusing more on the economic accountability. If you ask us, we would tell you it has to happen parallelly. It's not the economic crisis that caused us to be in the position that we are now, mixed up in a lot of international negotiations. It's the lack of human rights accountability, and it's the political crisis and the human rights crisis is what led us to the human rights accountability. I'm going to focus more on coming from a victim survivor point of view. As a victim and as someone who worked with victims for a long time, I emphasize this because I think sometimes we forget who we are doing this work for. And whose benefits needs to be in the center of this work, resolution, this dialogues and all of it. Again, from a victim point of view, we are yet to see any mechanism internally that worked. I think if victims, if you give the victims one proper example of a time a domestic mechanism worked, we might agree on a middle way. But you think hard about it, you cannot find one mechanism that worked. In Sri Lanka, criminals are sitting in parliaments. Credibly alleged war criminals are running the country. They are in all kinds of institutions. The head of the police have committed torture and other crimes. The military that we all know that committed crimes are still occupying a lot of space in the North and East after 15 years of war, and causing further challenges to normal daily life, but also sitting in new commissions that are supposed to be victim-centered. So the victim always asks one question, as you heard from Leeladevi, how can we ask justice and accountability from perpetrators themselves? This is the one question they've also been asking, and this is also why they are pushing for international accountability. But I think as a human rights community, our questions are also misplaced. I think it's easy to question the intention of the victim and survivors. Why do you have to go for international accountability? Why can't you settle for a domestic mechanism? Let's take the example of Office of the Missing Persons and Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Both of these commissions were started just before Human Rights Council here. We have an internal joke that Sri Lanka proposes and passes like new bills and commissions just before the Human Rights session. Again, the government does a lot of things to please the international community. So OMP is one such example that it started in 2017. It's been 6 years. We haven't seen any progress from OMP. OMB has lately been telling us for a year and a half now that they have solved 16, 18 cases. We are yet to see one of them. This is thrown as a reason in international spaces. We have solved these cases, but where are these cases? What happened to these cases? And they're also freely telling people that 2 of these people have died. But how can a national mechanism can tell people that 2 of these cases concluded in deaths and you're not going to give people information, right? There is no consideration to victims' mental well-being or re-traumatization, nothing. But when it comes to the government, 6 years is nothing. They can take all the time that they want. But the international community, states, the diplomat community have forced the families of the disappeared to engage with this mechanism. The families from the very beginning didn't want to engage, but under the pressure, they did submit 5 cases to OMP. They have never heard about these cases, and recently they've also heard that these 5 case files are misplaced. How are they supposed to believe in any domestic mechanism when the little things, the little administrative things are not properly taken care of? We're talking about Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it is being waived in everybody's faces as the last sort of thing to restore reconciliation and peace and whatnot. But many of the groups from the North and East have put out statements clearly saying this is not what they want. Sri Lanka also have a commission fever. We introduced commission after commission after commission. Victim communities have went before 10 to 16 different commissions. There are many recommendations. None of these have been implemented. And we ask the question, what happened to this recommendation? Why not implement this recommendation before starting a new commission? The UN reports have also mentioned there is no favorable environment in Sri Lanka to establish the Reconciliation Commission. But again, we are very sure this commission is going to come, and then it's going to re-traumatize victims again. But what does this mean for victim community? There are 2 things that I wanted to bring up. When we talk about victim communities or victim-centered approach, and again, this is also a term, particularly with the transitional justice agenda, it's a term that everyone freely uses, but no one really practices. Everybody is happy to use the term victim-centered, but we only want to inform the victims at the end of the process, or we just want to use the word so it looks good on papers. No one consults with them, no one tells them what it is, or their answers or their recommendations and requests are heard. I also want to remind that there was one time that this consultation process or this victim-centered approach worked when the transitional justice mechanism was established and when there were consultations happening as the first phase of the activity. If the government had listened to this consultation, and this is one consultation that every single person in Sri Lanka, any victim community, not Tamil, not Muslim, but all kinds of communities have participated, thinking that it's gonna get them somewhere. It's been sold as a solution. The hopes were not managed properly at that point, but it didn't take off anywhere. The government failed to capitalize on that and do anything with it. As a result, the civil society and the victim communities have lost trust in each other. The victim communities didn't want to participate in one other activity where they have to put their everything into it. I see this as a little relevant to what we have now in resolution and also as OSLAP. Because once again, in 2022, when this mandate was introduced, victims were approached to collect information, to consolidate information, and there is trust among victims for UN to collect evidence. How it will be used, how this mandate can evolve, and what accountability processes can come out of it is still yet to be answered, and there's always questions about this. But the very first step about including victims in the process, having it as a victim-centered approach, was practiced to most extent. And it's important for this mandate to continue so victims don't have to lose their hope one more time. And as civil society and as human rights community, I don't know if we can promise that we cannot give them the same kind of hope again. That brings me to my conclusion with 2 points, but before I get there, I'm not going to focus on a lot of these recommendations and options that are given. The OHCHR report has laid out a number of options for states and different groups of people who can take it forward, and also Pearl's report has very specific recommendations. I really urge you to read it. So I'm not going to go into it, but I think there are 2 things that we need to focus on. One, to reevaluate the transitional justice agenda, because if we let this kind of continue the way that Sri Lanka does it, Sri Lanka can become, set an example of how to evade justice and accountability while pretending to implement all pillars of transitional justice while ignoring the most important one. I think Sri Lanka should be a case study on this, but it will set a bad example. The second thing is to shift the burden of proving crimes from victims to other powerful entities such as states and UN. As you have heard from Leeladevi, the victims are also very tired of trying to do this for 15 years, collecting evidence, collecting testimonies, and having to go in front of different commissions and different groups have been so tiring on them. They had to do all of this while having to deal with the security apparatus in Sri Lanka. Surveillance and intimidation is a daily thing for them. Nobody even flinch anymore because it's normalized to that point. They need to be supported. As she mentioned, 250 mothers since the beginning of the protest have passed away, and that's not a simple thing. It's a collective pain these communities carry together. Every time we lose a victim, every time we lose someone who's a survivor of Mullivaikkal, we are losing evidence. We are losing a lot as a community. They need to be supported, and again, I will not go into the specific, but please look at the recommendations of what states can do. But there are also things that the states can ask the Sri Lankan government to do internally, because this accountability process is really long and exhausting, and while we have to survive there, one, strengthening the local judiciary in the country, and stop pardoning criminals who are convicted locally. Sanction and asset freeze, it's a common thing. We've seen some countries do this, but we also see there's such officers use this bans and asset freeze as a badge of honor. But this is important. This is why it has to happen very often. So it kind of stopped being a badge of honor at that point. At some point, a lot of assistance are pouring into the country at the moment. State and institutions that are providing financial assistance must impose human rights compliance related conditions on Sri Lankan government, and UN different mandates and OCHR, and also the states must monitor very closely what happens in the country, not just Colombo, not just the south, what you see on the mainstream media, but beyond that, what happens in the north and eastern province of Sri Lanka. What is the difference, and who is not being talked to is the most important thing. I want to end this with another quote from High Commissioner's report. I think it kind of summarizes all of it quite beautifully. Without accountability, the legacy of violence is simply more violence. And impunity is a cancer that weakens states and societies. But there's another path, paved with justice and accountability, that leads to healing, reconciliation, and peace. I urge Sri Lanka to follow it. Thank you.
If there are no questions, we will conclude the event. So we have reached the end of the event. We want to thank Leeladevi and Anushani for highlighting the lack of will of the Sri Lankan government for justice and accountability, which really emphasises what was written in the OHCHR report, encouraging the international community to bridge the accountability gap and to halt the culture of impunity that is on the island. Pearl has Pearl hopes that you will take a look at the briefing and share the briefing as well. Genocide recognition is an important measure of accountability in its own right and is one that can be pushed by the international community. And as we've heard today, the need for accountability is urgent. We'd like to thank all of you for attending our side event. I think the first one for Pearl as an ECOSOC-accredited organisation, so thank you. And like I said, the Pearl briefing is available on our website at www.pearlaction.org. Alternatively, please do either grab a copy of the executive summary at the back or scan the QR code to access the Pearl briefing. Thank you very much.